All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 7, Section 2, How Much Revolutionary Change. So recall, Section 7-1 talked mostly about politics and government, and certainly as a consequence of the American Revolution, the creation of a brand new country, and a brand new country that would be founded essentially on Enlightenment ideas was revolutionary. There really wasn't anything else in the world like that. However, this section looks at some of the ways in which American or colonial, now American society really didn't change all that much, where this term revolutionary might not be appropriate. And we could look to areas like society, we can look to areas like culture, we can look to categories like gender, that is the role that men and women play in society, and categories like race. And in these categories, this term revolutionary probably isn't the best term used to describe what had happened in colonial, now American society. So we're going to look first at the status of women. And overall, we can say that for the most part, the status of women really did not change much, right? Did not change much. Legally speaking, women could only be represented by their husbands. This idea is known as coverture. So coverture is essentially where women have no legal rights except through their husbands. In a certain sense, you could say that the law recognized wives especially as kind of like property of their husbands. This didn't change. This was the case in colonial America. It was the case in England. It was the case in now revolutionary America. So in that sense, we would not say it was a very revolutionary event, the American Revolution. In terms of the right to vote, women were denied the right to vote. Nowhere in the now 13 states were women given the right to vote intentionally, so denied political rights on that front as well. However, the revolution and the rhetoric of the revolution did make some inroads in terms of challenging some of these traditional norms. Abigail Adams was the wife of John Adams. You see the two pictured here. Here's Abigail, here's John. John Adams was one of 5 authors of the Declaration of Independence who would be an instrumental and key figure in creating these new governments, whether that was the state government of Massachusetts or the new national government. And Abigail Adams wrote a letter to her husband, John Adams, saying that when all of you men essentially create this new government, remember the ladies, keep in mind the wives and the husbands. This letter was not well received by John Adams, but it certainly showed a certain type of advocacy for the rights of women in this particularly early republic or early post-revolutionary period. You had other women like Mary Otis Warren, who had written or wrote a history on the American Revolution. This was typically a sort of a male-dominated field, the writing of histories. Here is Mary Otis Warren here. And so she was breaking gender norms with publishing that. Judith Sargent Murray advocated for women's economic independence. And maybe more importantly, advocated for women's access to education. And if you're going to point to any particular arena during the revolutionary period in which women saw the most change, now again, overall, we're going to say that the status of women did not change really all that much with the American Revolution. But if there is an arena where it did change, that was in the field of education. And what Murray essentially proposed, or what she advocated, was that women should have the same access to education as men. And you saw this reflected in a couple of ways. So for example, you look at the profession of teacher. More women increasingly found themselves in a teaching role. But also this idea of Republican motherhood, which was more or less supported by both American men and women at the time. And Republican motherhood was the idea that women's role in society, or women's duty to the nation, was to teach the children Republican or American values. Right? So the question of, and we talked about this previously, civic virtue, the sort of certain set of virtues and morals that a society needs in order for a Republican style of government to survive. Republican motherhood stated that it should be the mothers in the society, that is the duty of those women to teach the children about independence and freedom and everything else that is tied up with that, so that way they get the basis for what would cause the government to survive. So it didn't really break down any norms in terms of women's roles in society, of mothers and wives, but did so more in this field of teaching and education. When we look at categories like race, that also really didn't change all that much. Although there was a huge contradiction between the rhetoric of the revolution and the application from it, most of the founders in this post-revolutionary period believed that the United States was a white republic only, essentially saying those that were of African descent were relegated to slavery. Those who were Native Americans or Indians were generally not seen as part of the republic. They were equated to as savages. And so this notion of a white republic more or less was espoused by many of the founding types, ranging from Jefferson to Franklin to a lot of these other individuals who played a role in creating these new national governments. For slavery, there was a huge contradiction, right? And I want to point out Thomas Jefferson here in particular, because recall Thomas Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence. And in that, he had said that there were rights of life, or I guess I got liberty here first, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the reason why Thomas Jefferson is kind of the perfect example of this is because on the one hand, the rhetoric, what he wrote, had actually taken issue with slavery, but in practice, he seemed to have no reservations about it. He was willing to own more than 200 slaves. And not only do you see this in his writing and what he actually did, in fact, here's a list of all the slaves that Thomas Jefferson in fact owned. But I'm also going to use two examples, Phyllis Wheatley and Sally Hemings. These are both African women. Phyllis Wheatley was a poet. In fact, you see her written right here. And she published her poems at a time where practically all African women, or especially those who were enslaved, it was illegal for them to read and write. It was literally against the law. And she published literature and poetry that was so compelling that many white audiences didn't believe that in fact she was black, that because it was so good and so beautiful that could only come from the pen of a white woman or somebody else. She was in fact brought to trial over that particular reason. Thomas Jefferson wasn't necessarily impressed by Wheatley for her ability to produce really good poetry and literature. Sally Hemings was Jefferson's slave, but also Jefferson's mistress, who he had a number of different children with. And so this idea of viewing African Americans as inferior to whites, which Thomas Jefferson certainly did, but at the same time having an affair and having children with one of his slaves also goes to show this contradiction here. And this was something that was practiced or done or common enough that it was sort of a taboo in especially Southern society. Jefferson, however, did advocate, at least in writing, the abolition of slavery. But to go back and reinforce this point of creating a white republic is that even when Thomas Jefferson wrote about abolishing slavery, he also talked about removing African American or Africans from the U.S. population. And he was never able to fully push forward this idea because he received pushback from fellow politicians in Virginia This is a call right here, citizens to the southern states. This is a call to other southern plantation owners warning about Thomas Jefferson's position on wanting to abolish slavery, or at least publishing in his writing that he was morally, he objected to it morally. However, with all that being said, the message of freedom was still very powerful, and for others for other founders not named Thomas Jefferson, so you take your Benjamin Franklins, your John Adams, your George Washingtons. John Adams was a founding father that never owned slaves. Benjamin Franklin did in his younger years, but by the time of the American Revolution had been against it, both in writing and in practice. And then George Washington, who in fact was a slave owner but practiced manumission, which many other slave owners also did at the time, and that was to allow or what we might call it, say, willingly free your slaves. And so after the American Revolution, some states like Virginia allowed slave owners, if they wanted to have that choice, to free their slaves. George Washington did this upon his will. Thomas Jefferson did not. There were other groups of people who were outside what we might call the mainstream, also speaking against slavery, particularly with how it related to American values and religion. The Quakers, of course, we learned about. This is a religious group who were always very uncomfortable with the idea of slavery because of their belief in the inner light. The inner light was this idea of spiritual equality, right? That everybody has an inner light inside of them, and that we're all spiritually equal. So they were always uncomfortable with it. By the time of the American Revolution, with that rhetoric, the Quakers, full on make owning slaves a banishable offense. You have people like Dr. Benjamin Rush, who speaks out on this. You have organizations like the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which becomes one of the very first anti-slavery societies. You have many northern states who are moving towards an abolitionist position. So, for example, immediately after the American Revolution, the Massachusetts Constitution abolished slavery. Now, of course, this wasn't fully done in practice, but at least in the law, if you were a slave in Massachusetts, immediately when the revolution was over, you were free. However, most northern states moved towards a gradual emancipation, right? So these are most northern states. And so while it's true that you could say something like, after the American Revolution, half of the United States moved towards emancipation. In Massachusetts, it was done immediately. In other northern states, it took a little bit of time. But the reality was there wasn't that many slaves living in those states. Save maybe a state like New York, which might have had a large enslaved population. So certainly for those individuals who earned or not earned or were granted their emancipation, this had a huge impact. But for most enslaved Africans in the United States, this didn't have that much of an impact because most of them were in the southern states. And so we have to question, what is the impact or the practicality of these measures? Did it really lead to a mass emancipation? And the answer is no, it did not, right? Because it was the southern states that most people were enslaved in. In terms of the role that Native Americans played in this post-revolutionary society, it was very complicated. Again, the Treaty of Paris had really no regard for Indian land. So if we look at this map here, right, this is essentially where the United States lies. Before the American Revolution, the 13 colonies more or less consisted of this area right here on the right-hand side, right? That was what it was before. All of this land was now ceded to the U.S. This had previously belonged to Great Britain. Now it was possession of the United States of America. However, that land didn't necessarily belong to the British. It belonged to many of these various tribes that had occupied that land for a long period of time. And whereas the British were willing to set up a proclamation line, that is to stem colonial migrations over over the Appalachian Mountains, the colonial governments really aren't. The colonial governments we haven't covered this yet, are interested in selling that land. And so the Treaty of Paris, again, had really no regard for Indian land or Indian rights. Now, many Native Americans sided with either the British or the American side. For the most part, Native Americans did not fare well as a result of the Revolution. Those that allied themselves with the colonists might have fared just slightly better. Recall Joseph Brant. He was a Mohawk leader. He had sided with the British. And after the British surrendered at Yorktown, really continued resistance against the new American government. And so, you had continued fighting happening in this particular region even after the British had surrendered. And this was done against primarily those who were allied with the British, or who recognized that once the British surrendered, now really is the only time to resist colonial advancement. However, though, Native Americans were defeated by the United States. The Treaty of Grenville, we could say this was won by the U.S., gave the United States sort of legal access to the Ohio region. And so this was in a lot of ways a continuation, right? A continuation of the Revolutionary War. Now, one area which you did see, in fact, maybe a much more pronounced change was in the arena of religion. So for the most part, colonial governments had official religions. The days of the Quakers are kind of, they're far in the past. Or sorry, the days of the Puritans are kind of far in the past. But, each colony had their own official religion. And in order to hold office, you needed to subscribe to certain religious beliefs. Generally speaking, after the American Revolution, that was axed, and you had sort of a new sense of religious freedom, right? Religious freedom. Now, this wasn't the case in all of the colonies. In Virginia, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom might be what we might call the most extreme, right? It more or less opened up for a practice of whatever religion that you wanted. In New England, these states were much slower to, we might say much slower to enact religious freedom. It isn't until, the 1800s to the 1820s, but eventually those come around. But generally speaking, what impact did the Revolution have on religion? It got rid of official religions, so whereas states didn't have official religions, and it led to more religious freedom.